It's 1962. The Cold War between Soviet Russia and the United States is in full swing, and America is waist deep in a desperate battle to stop the infectious spread of communism. Most of these countries turning to communism were at least on the other side of the planet where we didn't have to smell them. But one of them just so happened to be 90 miles south of Florida, the island nation of Cuba. In 1959, guerrilla forces leader Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and established the country as the first communist nation in the Western Hemisphere. With an anti-American firebrand communist in the driver's seat, Cuba in short order became a national security concern and worst enemies with the United States. Forget baseball. In the early 60s, trying to topple Fidel Castro was America's favorite pastime. We had plots to sabotage, failed assassination attempts, a failed invasion attempt of the island, plots for false flag attacks as a pretext for invasion, but over the course of 50 years, the US would never manage to close the deal. Castro was to America what the Roadrunner is to Wile E. Coyote. And while we're on that Looney Tunes note, did you know that the CIA tried to kill Fidel Castro with an exploding cigar? That's not even the weirdest recorded idea. Seriously, look into CIA versus Castro if you want to see some outlandish takedown plots. There were supposedly hundreds of attempts to assassinate Castro, both foreign and domestic in origin. None of them succeeded. He died of natural causes in 2016 at the age of 90. President Kennedy didn't even outlive his own presidency. Unlike the rest of the world, the United States just wasn't used to living right next to someone who wanted to destroy them. Luckily for America, Cuba, for the most part, was just a little yappy dog with no teeth. Unluckily for America, that was about to change. Castro reached out for help and allied Cuba with the big bad Soviet Union, which meant that they would be showered in their blessings of weapons and money and perhaps best of all, direct protection under their wing from American aggression. After Cuba and the USSR became buddies, American spy planes began noticing a buildup of Soviet weapons on the island. U.S. President John F. Kennedy issued a warning to cut it out, but his words fell on deaf ears. What happened next was arguably the biggest flashpoint of the Cold War, and in a worst-case scenario, could have led to a hot war and a nuclear slugfest between the world's two largest superpowers of the day. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane snapped reconnaissance images in a high-altitude pass over Cuba. What they captured was evidence of multiple nuclear sites for medium and intermediate-range missiles and even a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled right there on the island. Nuclear weapons, the MacGuffin for every good modern-day tyrant, were about to be right at Castro's fingertips. When Washington saw the photos, they reached a unanimous resolution of, yeah, we're not doing that. To help quickly resolve the issue and get the missiles out of Cuba, President Kennedy assembled an executive committee of officials and advisors known as XCOM. With an E. XCOM with an E. Yes. Wait, is that Dr. Strangelove? Whatever, it works, I guess. The real task at hand was removing Cuba's potential nuclear capabilities without triggering serious military backlash from Russia. It's just like that game, Don't Wake Daddy, but replace Daddy with a nuclear holocaust. For XCOM, all options were on the table, from a full-scale invasion of Cuba, which would have been very risky, to stern warnings which almost certainly would have done nothing. Russia already had to be wary of NATO and US nuke bases peppered all across Western Europe. Putting nukes in Cuba was a move meant to help protect Cuba, but also boost their own nuclear strike capabilities and help level the playing field with the United States. President Kennedy sent a letter to Russian President Nikita Khrushchev voicing his displeasure of the arms and missile sites and told the Soviets to pack up their nukes and get out of town. Yes, he sent him a letter. Can you imagine having something called a missile crisis happen and the person you need to talk to stop it lives on the other side of the hemisphere and you have to communicate through hand-delivered letters? Kennedy also went on TV to address the nation bluntly and told us that America's second biggest foil was on the cusp of having operational nuclear missiles that could hit almost anywhere in the continental United States, including Washington, D.C. He also explained that he had ordered the U.S. Navy to set up a quarantine around the island to cut off any further Soviet supply shipments. President Khrushchev called the blockade quarantine a move of aggression and warned that Cuba-bound Soviet ships would not be deterred by the U.S. Navy. This, of course, set up an eventual nail-biting confrontation at sea. When Soviet ships entered the Caribbean with their latest shipments, they wisely halted their approach to Cuba. Had they tried to cross the blockade, there would have been a naval skirmish, and then who knows what. Remember, the U.S. held the vast majority of the cards when it came to launching a tactical nuclear strike, and bluffing or not, it just wasn't in Russia's best interest to play chicken with them. At this time, U.S. military forces were bumped up to DEFCON 2, the second highest state of readiness, basically meaning war is about to happen, be ready to move out on my signal. Things actually got worse when a U.S. spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Forces assembled in Florida for an invasion of Cuba, and many thought, well, that's it. Repent, the end is nigh. But correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev continued. Khrushchev made the U.S. an offer. Russia would remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The U.S. said, great, we have a deal. A second letter received soon after said, oh, and P.S., can you remove those pesky nukes from your base in Turkey? And the U.S. said, that's not as great, but we'll still take it. The USSR dismantled the Cuban missile sites, but the naval blockade remained in effect until they made sure to take their bomber aircraft too. Thus the 2-week-long crisis came to an end. The Cold War was still long from being over, and the focus for Russia now would be to heavily invest in long-range missiles it could launch effectively from its own soil. But in the wake of the crisis, a communications hotline was established between Washington and Moscow as a diplomatic way of diffusing future crises, which was a good idea. You don't want a nuclear apocalypse happening just because your apology letter is still on a plane 2 hours from Moscow.